Hello students, today I'm going to share with you how to integrate quotations in your writing. If you learn this skill, you're instantly going to become a much better writer, and it's also very simple to do, so let's get started. We use quotes in our writing when using evidence, and we're talking about direct quotations. But they need to be set up or ended with our own words. We cannot have quotes as their own sentences, and I'm going to repeat this phrase a lot. Quotes cannot stand alone. Remember that, and if you don't, I'm going to hammer it into your head consistently throughout this video. So here is a sample from an actual student who got a good grade on a paper, but there was one thing that they definitely needed to work on, and that is integrating quotations. So he says that Atticus taught her and Jem a very valuable idea that would influence the way they viewed the town of Macomb throughout the rest of the novel and the rest of their lives, period. They have ended their sentence there. But then what's next? What's next is a quote. And it's alone. But a quote cannot stand alone. A quote cannot stand alone. So obviously there needs to be some fixes here because you cannot do this. It is a cardinal sin of writing. It is a cardinal sin in academia to just drop in a quote, or what I call vomiting in a quote into a paragraph with really no explanation and no warning, and it just kind of gets thrown into the reader's face like, here's a quote, but I don't know what to do with that quote. I don't even know why it's in there. I have to now do more work. You need to use the quote to support your argument. I want to hear more from you than I do from some other author. Because if I want to hear from that other author, I'll read their book. But I'm reading your essay. I'm reading your paper. So you need to make the quotes work for you. You're their boss. So, quotes cannot stand alone. But what do we do to fix this? What do we do to make sure that a quote is not its own sentence? Well, tip number 1, you can use the quote within your own sentence, and you won't need a comma if you do this. And I'll show you what this means. So we have our sample text that we're going to use off of. This is the quote that we want to integrate. And this is an example of how you might be able to do this. So my own words come first. Notice that's the first thing. The underlined portion is Harper Lee's words. The italic portion is mine. When talking with Scout, Atticus says that, and then the quote. Now notice I highlighted the words says that because I want you to pay attention to it when the next examples come up. So I have my own words first and then the quote, because a quote cannot stand alone. So it's not its own sentence here. It is coming after my own words. So here's some other examples here. And again, remember that phrase says that. Oliver Queen was on a mission for revenge and often stated that people, quote, have failed his city. For the most part, my quotes are going to be made up, but this one is real. But notice the pattern here. It says stated that. Notice the word that is coming up. The next example, Donald Trump extended the voluntary quarantine by saying that, quote, people need to do their part and stay at home to defeat the virus. So notice in all three examples here, I have used a verb like saying or stated, some type of expression verb followed by the word that. I didn't need any punctuation. No commas are there. It would actually be incorrect if I put a comma after that. Ultimately, tip number 1 is that you can use a quote in your own sentence without any punctuation, but you do need to use the word that. And that makes our equation here a signal phrase plus the word that plus the quote. Tip number 2 is within your own sentence, you can use a quote, this time with a comma. So we have how to do it without a comma, using the word that. Here is when do we use a comma before a quote? And here's our sample text, and here's how I was able to do it. When talking with Scout, Atticus says, comma. Notice what's highlighted. I'm not saying the word that here. I'm saying the word says. It's an expression phrase, but the word that is not there, which tells me I need a comma. So let's look at some other examples. Donald Trump extended the voluntary quarantine by saying, quote, and notice what's before, a comma. The word that is not showing up. Next example, Dr. Benjamin asked, what are your symptoms? So there's an expression phrase, it is a verb, followed by the quote. There's no word that, so that means I have to use a comma. Last example, someone deep in the crowd stood up and proclaimed. So the rule here for tip number 2 is you can use a quote in your own sentence with a comma if you do not use words like that, whether, or if. or other conjunctions as well, but those are some of the more prominent ones. And our equation for tip number 2 would be a signal phrase plus an expression verb, like says, said, proclaimed, plus a comma, plus a quote. So notice tip number 1 and tip number 2 are very similar. The only difference is when you use the word that, you do not need a comma. When you don't have the word that, you do need a comma. But what about tip number 3? Tip number 3 is very different. It's using a colon. Now, most students are afraid of using a colon unless they're about to list something. They don't know when else to use it. And notice, importantly, I'm saying colon, not semicolon. And so you need to set apart a quote using a colon. So this is the only instance in which a quote is actually going to look like its own sentence, but it's actually not because you're using a colon. So let's take a look. We have our sample text, and here's what I was able to do with it. Atticus sat down and instilled wisdom into Scout. You have here a independent clause. It is a complete sentence, and then I use a colon to introduce the quote. It is your way of signaling to the reader that you're about to use a quote. So let's look at some other examples. During a live press conference, President Trump urged Americans to heed the federal government, colon, and then the quote. Again, complete sentence, then the colon, then I can quote. This is the only way in which you could actually set apart a full quote apart from your own words. Another example, Dr. Benjamin argued for additional funds from the government to help his hospital, colon, and then the quote. So again, there is a complete sentence followed by a colon and then the quote. So before we had this student sample, and we said that this is incorrect. But look at what they could have done so simply to fix this. Now, all they had to do was put one little period above the period that they already have and make it into a colon, and it would have been a correct sentence, and they would have signaled to me that they were about to use a quote, and it would have been higher level writing. So that's already 3 ways that you can fix these. So just know you can set apart a quote from your own writing, but it has to come after a complete sentence and a colon. So ultimately, you would have a complete sentence plus a colon plus your quote. So the last strategy I'm going to share is blending, and this is where you're going to use short instances of quotes and sprinkle them throughout, and you will not use punctuation unless it's already necessary in the sentence. And so we have our sample text, and our example here is Atticus sat down and instilled wisdom into Scout. He sat down with Scout and explained, quote, you never really know who a person is on the inside. Another quote, until you consider things from his point of view. He used verbs like, quote, climb and walk, another quote, to let her know it requires effort to do this. So notice what I did. I took the quote that I wanted to use up at the top, but I pulled a bunch of stuff out and I sprinkled it into my own writing. This is one way in which you can lengthen your writing and lengthen your paragraphs, but also it just sounds better. You don't always need full quotes. You can sprinkle in the words and phrases that you want to use, and this is how you become a much better writer. So here's some examples of doing that. Trump urges Americans, quote, to do their part, but many refuse to socially distance themselves from others. If people practice social distancing, Trump is confident we, quote, can defeat the virus. So again, I sprinkled the quotes throughout. I didn't use the entire segment. Instead, I tore them apart and I used it to my advantage to lengthen what I was saying and make it sound better. Here's another example. Dr. Benjamin argues that he needs, quote, the federal government to step up and deliver additional funds so that they get the, quote, assistance that is necessary for them to serve people. Again, it's sprinkling here. I like to call this, and other people do, blending, because it's just that. It is literally blending somebody else's words into your own, and you don't even need a signal here, right? There's no full signal phrase because you're actually using the quotes into your own sentences. So you can use short quotes and phrases without punctuation. You can literally hijack them to make them work for your own sentence. In this case, you're sprinkling them in. But those are 4 strategies in which you can integrate your quotations more effectively. So why does this matter? Ultimately, your voice must be prominent in your writing, because after all, it is your writing. The quotes are just supposed to support what you're saying. If the quotes make up more of your writing, and there's a lot of lengthy quotes and quotes that are their own sentences, it's really no longer your paper. You've just said random stuff, and you were relying on somebody else's work to do your argument for you. But that's not going to fly. That's not going to work. It is very easy to vary your sentences up. It is very easy to vary the way that you integrate quotations. You just need to get used to it, and you just need to put in the work. And once you do it, I guarantee you your writing will go from a lower level to a higher level immediately.